ability to be detached from the body to that extent, suffering is keenly felt. We feel suffering because we are identified with the body. If we're not identified with the body, we don't feel suffering. And we can see, even as devotees, at least I experience, I'm certainly not a harmonious level, that going through various tribulations or even physical issues as a devotee is nothing like it was before, when I was had no idea of spiritual life. For one thing, we know that we are gradually being delivered. And this is something that is not just a kind of intellectual concept. It's something that you actually feel as Krishna consciousness progresses. Even if you're not very progressive, or even if you're not, on the highest level, still you feel a sense that you're accomplishing something, you're moving forward, and you begin to see how through living a life where you're focused on trying to serve Krishna, even however imperfectly you're trying to serve Krishna, you are being removed from the material desires that you once followed very, very carefully. And you begin to get the perspective that if you had been following those material desires your whole life, which is what everybody generally does, you would be in real deep doo-doo at this point. That's the issue. Because most people just follow their material desires. In other words, most people live an unconscious and robotic life. They have, because of past lives, various programmed desires. They have chosen those desires, and those desires have come to them. And life after life, they basically follow the same pattern. The samskaras are there. You follow the patterns, and anytime you follow material desires, you can expect that suffering will come in the wake. Material desires are never satisfied, and they burn like fire. We want to satisfy them, but we can't satisfy them completely. Or we do satisfy them to some extent, and we discover that we need more just to satisfy ourselves. And while we are rummaging through the material world for the ability and the resources to enjoy our material, we encounter things which we absolutely did not want. Not only does we find that sometimes we're able to make or find our way to the objects of appropriate desire for our senses. Sometimes we're able to find our way, but sometimes exactly the opposite happens. That we discover situations which are exactly the opposite of what we had hoped for. And in some ways, those situations are extremely painful or extremely distressing. And we don't know what to do about it. So this is the situation. Now, if you're sufficiently dulled out by material mode of ignorance, then essentially you just live in the moment. You enjoy things and you suffer, mostly you're bored, sometimes you're frightened. And you go from one day to another, and you never think about the ultimate goal of life. You never think about anything other than what's to be enjoyed in the next 15 minutes. It's your entire focus of life. And because you are, thinking that way, then your life ends and you don't have any real progress. But as I say, where ignorance is bliss, it is folly to be wise. So, is ignorance really bliss, though? Well, certainly, as we've discussed before, material meeting of the senses with their objects, there's certainly some kind of pleasure there. You can, dispute that. There is a certain kind of pleasure in the senses meeting their objects. But it neither lasts, nor is it substantial, nor does it give you a sense of having any kind of deep satisfaction. It's very superficial. And there was a writer in Western literature, Oscar Wilde, once said that there are two great tragedies in life. One of those tragedies is not getting what you desperately want in life. And the other great tragedy is getting what you desperately want in life. And there was a cartoon also that is in the same line by another cartoonist or humorist writer named James Thurber, where it showed two mountains and two characters at the bottom of this mountain. And there's a long, winding, twisting trail going to the top of one of the mountains. And there's a long, winding, twisting trail going up to the top of the other mountain. And there's a signpost at the bottom where they're standing in the valley between two mountains, with two twisting trails up to the top of the mountain. And the signpost on one of the trails says, "A meaningful life." And on the other signpost it says, "An indifferent existence." And the character, two of them are standing at the bottom. One says, "It's odd that they should both be uphill." And so essentially, this is the situation we're in. Even if you don't want to engage in any austerity, you still will. Even if you don't care, you'll still struggle like anything. Even if you don't make any effort to overcome the difficulties of life, they'll still come upon you. And similarly, if you do, you'll still suffer, you'll still struggle. However, as Prabhupada mentions here, you have the understanding that this will be your last time of going through these suffering. This is kind of the final playthrough. So sometimes we say that devotees don't suffer. And to the extent that again, we are beyond our senses, beyond identification with the body. To that extent, we don't suffer. But generally, as devotees, we also undergo all kinds of tribulations. And I think recently someone quoted the verse, "Tatem kapam shushum shaman mujane bhaktam pakam pridvaka purvir vididan namaste dive yoga patisataya pakam." One who tolerates the difficulties that come upon him, all the while glorifying the Supreme Lord of the body, mind, and word. Such a person is a suitable candidate for liberation because it becomes rightful claim. Tatte kampam shushvishmana mujana eva kritam pakam ridvaga purvir vididan namaste chideyo patisataya. So if one thinks in terms of whatever sufferings I'm undergoing, I should probably have more I'm actually probably guilty enough that I'm getting a diminished or mostly written off version of the karma that was headed my way. But I'm getting some measure of it, so I don't make these same mistakes again, and that I will make an effort to still, in spite of all my difficulties, offer praise to the Supreme Lord, instead of being either angry at the Supreme Lord or being completely despondent or completely morose. Of course, if somebody's angry at God, at least they're angry at the right person. So they have genuinely understood that everything is really coming from the Supreme Lord. So pretty good. Then the next thing that we should recognize, we are maybe the Lord, but why are we experiencing difficulty? Maybe we had something to do with it. And sometimes I like to say when the UPS package comes with your miseries included on the inside, if you look on the waiting list, you'll see your signature. You ordered it. So this is the nature of the world. So as we become more and more aware of what's going on and we please the Supreme Lord, we take our miseries less seriously, and we know, well, today my foot hurts, but tomorrow probably won't hurt. Instead, my arm will hurt, something else will hurt. And we know that the material world is kind of like this. One day we are a little bit miserable, next day we feel great, next day we feel a little bit miserable again. And so this is the sine wave of material existence that we go from, things seeming like they're heading our way to where we feel like we're being dumped on by everything, to again feeling like things are going our way. And after a while, we just forget to keep score anymore. We know that whatever it is now is going to change. There was one time in a book I read that there is one piece of advice that is applicable in every situation. Of course, that one piece of advice, we could say is to always think of the Supreme Lord, that's there too. But there's another piece of advice that applies in all situations, and that piece of advice is, this too shall pass. If you're in a good situation, this too shall pass. If you're in a bad situation, this too shall pass. If you're in a fearful situation, this too shall pass. So whatever it is, that's the nature of the material world. I like to try to point out the fact that misery or happiness, we talk about happiness, happiness is one of the three most misunderstood words in the English language. The three misunderstood words in the English language are love, happiness, and freedom. Those three words, everybody thinks they know what those words mean, but most people, if you actually ask them what is meant by those words, would be very confused if they had to try to explain them deeply, because they don't actually know what these words mean. Happiness is usually construed to mean the meeting of the senses with appropriate sense objects. That's usually what's described as happiness, but that's not happiness, because it doesn't last, and it causes, usually, as we chase after material happiness,
we develop the karma that causes us to suffer. So it's not really happiness. And of course, love has nothing to do with some kind of romantic feelings that we have towards somebody. Love is actually a transitive verb. It means doing something for the benefit of someone else. And of course, the highest love is to do that for the Supreme Lord. And freedom, nobody's free. We can just choose what we want to be free from. We can be free from material sufferings, or we can be free from regulations. As was mentioned a couple of days ago, devotional service starts with sadhana bhakti, which means we perform devotional service under regulations. And then that segues into Raganuga and finally Ragatmika Bhakti, where we have spontaneous love for the Supreme. And we don't have to worship the Supreme. We spontaneously want to. We don't force ourselves to do things which are kind of uncomfortable or a little bit out of our ease, but we spontaneously run after the Supreme Lord helplessly. So that's the difference. But if we perform sadhana bhakti, we will eventually get there. Now, in the Madhurya Kadambini by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, it mentions that devotional service is Kleshagni and Subhadha. So when the Bhakti Lata Bij, the creeper of devotion, is planted by the spiritual master, then the little creeper or vine starts to grow up, starts to become bigger. And an interesting thing is that in the Madhurya Kadambini, it mentions it has two beginning leaves, and those are Kleshagni and Subhadha. And it's interesting that most plants are dicotyledon, that they have two leaves that are seed leaves that start off with the plant. So that kind of, not only is it sort of a nice metaphoric analogy, but it's also kind of basic botany at the same time, So both things are there. Now, Kleshagni means kleshas are material sufferings. And so Gani means to kill. So it kills material sufferings. And Subhadha means, Da means to give, and Subha it gives auspiciousness. So the devotional activity that's performed by getting the Bhakti Lata Bij, one begins to experience both of these things. In the Madhurya Kadambini, it says that they don't come exactly at the same time, but more or less at the same time. And this is what we will not just think about, but we will genuinely experience as we mature and go forward in spiritual life. So it also mentions in the Madhurya Kadambini that the source of misery is false ego, ignorance, material engrossment, material desires, and things like this. These are the things that cause us misery. By having these things in our lives, if we focus on our false ego, if we involve ourselves in material desires, if we're materially engrossed, if we're envious of others, all these qualities are what will bring misery to our lives. So that's an important thing. Let me stop at this point and see if anyone has any questions or comments. Do we have our little pass around mic? Is that available somewhere?
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you so
Yeah.
much for giving class. As always, I could probably ask a million questions, especially from this particular verse, because this
Right.
has been on my mind since I've gotten in the temple. So maybe I can just ask one question.
Okay.
So, as a neophyte, usually I've heard right there's 4 reasons why someone comes to Krishna consciousness, and one of those is right trying to escape material suffering.
That's right.
So, as a neophyte, how can we identify the difference between material suffering and spiritual suffering? You know, and you also said, um, you know, we have some karma that's coming our way, and for us to understand that, oh, maybe now we're only getting like a scrap of it. Like I remember Prabhupada, he would say like, oh, you might have broken your arm, but now you might just get like a paper cut, or you know, you might break your finger. As a neophyte, how can we see those as blessings and not as deterrents? Like the suffering that I felt materially and the suffering that I felt spiritually feels the same. How can I tell the difference?
Yeah. Well, suffering is suffering. Uh, there's, in one sense, there's no such thing as spiritual suffering. What we're what we're getting is the minimized blowback of our, life of rejecting the Supreme Lord. That's what we're getting, and in most cases, the only thing we need to do is just to tolerate it, as that verse we were saying, tate nukampam shushamikshamanam. So we just need to tolerate it. And it helps if we don't think, why me? Why is this happening to me? Instead, we think, well, maybe I should be suffering even more, and we think that the Supreme Lord is like a doctor, and if you have a splinter or if you have some serious problem, the doctor sometimes has to perform surgery, and that surgery might be somewhat painful, but the end result will be that you will be cured. So there's a kind of suffering that is of no value. In other words, it's just suffering for suffering's sake. And after you finish suffering, you will go on to suffer in some other way. But there is a kind of suffering which we call tapas, which is a suffering that we voluntarily undertake. And by undertaking that suffering, we end all suffering in the future, though we still are, experiencing suffering. If we're experiencing suffering, that means certainly we are identifying with the body, and certainly we are not very purified yet. Because those who are in deep spiritual awareness are hardly even aware of their leaving the body, what to speak of other kinds of ordinary suffering. But that's a long road or a high road to hoe. So that's, I think, a very important thing to aspire to. And just remember that it's good to meditate on the wrong things we've done, the offenses we've committed, the selfishness we perpetrated. And if you don't think you have any of this, then it means you either are not really looking very introspectively, or you really are minimizing your own, faults to a really extreme degree. Yeah. Also, thank you for that nice class yesterday. I saw it on the video. I was in a meeting at that time, but
Well, I have a question in connection with Prabhu's question.
yeah,
That sometimes, it's easy to understand when we suffer, we see it as our karma, and it's much more reduced for us to handle. So that we don't suffer that much as we were supposed to suffer when we were out of Krishna consciousness.
right.
Whereas when we read scriptures, we see how Pandavas they suffer, and all Prahlad Maharaj suffering, and they undergo
Right.
immense amount of suffering. And at least for Prahlad Maharaj, we see even when he was suffering, he was actually not suffering because he was always chanting name of Lord Narayan. But when we read the story of Pandavas, so Prabhupada says they're pure devotees, but when they were suffering, they were really like suffering.
Right.
If you read Mahabharata, then we see that they were actually undergoing that suffering, like Draupadi Vastraharan. So then, how do we understand that? Sometimes we may compare ourselves with Pandavas and feel a little hesitant to take up to Krishna consciousness
Right.
completely because we don't want to undergo suffering. We are coming to Krishna consciousness to avoid suffering, and we see here there's immense suffering because Krishna is putting such high level of tests.
Well, the blissful thing is that suffer you will, whether you take the Krishna consciousness or not. And that's the bliss of that. Either way, you're going to suffer, the material energy doesn't cut anybody a break. You can be rich, you can be poor, you'll still suffer. You can be a man, you can be a woman, you'll still suffer. You can be old or you can be a young child, you'll still suffer. You can be very pure, or you can be completely, self-interested and demoniac, and you'll still suffer. Nobody gets a break in the material world. That's kind of one of those interesting and blissful things about this place, that makes us love it all the more, and eventually helps us to get the enough thrust to get escape velocity from this material world, so we think of it that way. What's interesting too is with the Pandavas, there's this, I always find it a humorous section in the Mahabharata where Draupadi is speaking with Yudhishthira. It's right after they've lost the second dice match, and they're placed into, they're wearing basically forest dweller rags, and they're, you know, uh, learning to live in the outdoors, in the forest, And she says to Yudhishthira, "My dear husband, look at you. You are living proof that karma doesn't work. You are only virtue personified. You never do anything even remotely adharmic. And yet we are living here in the forest, sleeping on the cold, wet ground. And Duryodhan is living now, eating the fine foods in the palace at Hastinapur." Uh, so she's saying this to Yudhishthira, and Yudhishthira says, "My dear wife, you are speaking exactly like an atheist." And Draupadi says, "Actually, I know that I don't really think this way, but I am so frustrated at this situation that we have found ourselves in." So yes, you can look at it both ways. And why Krishna allowed the Pandavas to apparently go through the tribulations they did, I think it has a lot to do with what I call the spotlight, principle. That when a person steadfastly and with great care tries to serve and engage in spiritual life, even under trials and very difficult conditions, that person is like a spotlight on them. Other people say, "Well, look at that." Somebody could say, "Well, the devotees of the Lord, they just follow because the Lord makes it easy for them." In one sense, yes, the Lord does make it easy for us. But in situations like this, when somebody still, in spite of hell and high water, that they're still engaged in spiritual life, then people take notice of that. And that's the point, I think, that you can look at the life of Jesus Christ, or you can look at the life of Prabhupada, or you can look at the life of so many devotees that they had to struggle in a lot of ways. And the fact that they did undergo such tribulation makes them even more glorious. And that's why people look to them later on. If we had gone through, or if, the great devotees had not gone through any kind of extreme episode in their lives, they would not be singled out in such an exemplary way as the fact that they were actually undergoing that, And, it is a fact that, as the common modern saying is, that no good deed ever goes unpunished. That's a fact of life too, that when you try to do the right thing, you will also understand that even though you're doing the right thing, it doesn't mean that you won't hit flack in the process of even doing the right thing. We got ourselves into this mess, so we've got no one else to blame, no one else to point the finger at, really. And now we're going to have to undergo some tapas to get out. Tapo divyam putrikayena sattvam. So we have to undergo as Rishabdev says, the various kinds of austerity to reclaim our original spiritual existence and the world where that spiritual existence can be carried out. Other question? Yes.
Hare Krishna. First of all, thank you very much for reminding me that I can't enjoy this material world. I feel like I need to hear it every day.
Right.
Wanted to ask, why are we getting bored in our routines doing spiritual life? Why are we getting bored? And how to get over
Why
it?
are we getting which?
Bored. Boredom.
Boredom. Spiritual life. Yeah. Well, there is, rasa, which is what we translate into English as taste. So if someone is properly performing devotional service, there will be taste or rasa. Now, in the course of performing devotional service, sometimes we make offenses or we fail to perform devotional service properly. So in such occurrences, we may experience a lack of taste. In fact, if you are consistently making offenses against devotees, that's how Krishna gets you to go out the back door, is by removing your taste. And you start thinking, why am I knocking myself out in this crazy place with all these knuckleheads, what's the point of this? I could be making money, I could be doing something with my life, and then you go out the back door and you realize that you've just plopped back into material existence. But you don't care because you think devotees are a waste of time. And certainly living amongst devotees has its tribulations, that it's no easy thing living with others, So, but over time, we begin to see we did the wrong thing. That it wasn't them, it was me, And so this is one reason. Other reasons are that the Supreme Lord is trying to turn up the volume on your spiritual life. So sometimes we have no apparent taste, but we continue to soldier on anyways, and in time we will have, spiritual taste. That's the whole part of sadhana bhakti, as we were discussing, that there's sadhana bhakti and there is ragatmika or raganuga bhakti. And the difference between the two is one is spontaneous. And ragatmika bhakti means that there is spontaneous taste, and one feels automatically inspired. Whereas with uh, sadhana bhakti, one doesn't necessarily feel any kind of impetus. One is going through regulations and through various kinds of standard processes that we may or may not have feeling while doing. The reason we don't have feeling is because of our past sins, our neglect, our offenses, etc., etc. So all these things are what can eclipse our ecstasy. As we hear that there is, the holy name is able to blow away all of our sinful uh, repercussions, all of our karma that's coming our way. It's able to completely blow it away. But we're constantly creating new sinful action. And like the sun, the holy name is never obscured by a tiny cloud. Yet, because of our position in the world and due to our offenses, even though the sun is vast and a cloud is very tiny, yet the cloud obscures our ability to see the sun. So this is, why we talk about, the namabas, or the cloudy version. So, in other religions, in Christianity, this is called the dark night of the soul, where we are we know what we should be doing and we're convinced of doing it, but we just have to soldier on through what appears to be like a desert, because we have given up material happiness that we were accustomed to and is easy for us to indulge in, but we have yet to experience the spiritual taste that comes from full implementation of spiritual consciousness. So we're kind of in a netherworld, a desert between two places, but in time, the full measure of spiritual happiness will be realized. So ignorance, material engrossment, envy, material desires, these things are what cause misery. So we have to work at removing them. All right, so we are over time here, and I thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna. All right, I'm glad you did that. Otherwise, I would have forgotten. I was just about to forget.